Welcome, everyone. My name is Kathleen Lane, and I'm the Executive Director of the EdCan Network and your host for today's conversation on the right to learn, from global principles to Canadian classrooms. Joining me today is Sara Austin, Jean-Frédéric Hübsch, and Geneviève Grégoire-Labrecque. The EdCan Network is a national bilingual charity connecting education professionals and researchers and other partners to share research and practical expertise to enhance learning and well-being in our schools and school systems. We publish evidence-informed tools and resources and host a wide variety of virtual events to connect educators from across the country. EdCan's work takes place across the traditional territories of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have stewarded and cared for these lands for millennia. As we get started today, please take a moment to reflect on where you're joining from and the opportunities and lessons that the land offers you. Education is universally recognized as a human right, but where does this idea come from, and what does it mean in practice? In this panel conversation, we will explore the origins of the right to education, both internationally and in Canada. We'll also debunk some of the common myths and misconceptions that arise when we start hearing talk about the right to education. So joining me for the conversation today is Sara Austin, the founder and CEO of Child First Canada, Jean-Frédéric Hübsch, Ph.D. candidate with the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa, and an executive member of the Child and Youth Law section of the Canadian Bar Association, and Geneviève Grégoire-Labrecque, a recently completed her PhD in Applied Human Sciences at Concordia University. So welcome. So Sara, Jean-Frédéric, Geneviève, as we get started, I'll invite each of you to share a few words about yourself and why this topic's important for you. Sara, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sara Austin, founder and CEO of Children First Canada. I'm joining you today from Calgary, Alberta, in Treaty 7 territory. For the past 3 decades, I have been working to champion the rights of kids here in Canada and around the world. Children First is a national charity that's on a mission to make Canada the best place in the world for kids to grow up. We work alongside children, youth, parents, educators, and policymakers to do research, advocate, and to empower children and youth to realize their rights. For me, this topic is really important. I'm an advocate for kids here in Canada and globally, but I'm also a mom raising a kid in the education system. And, I think we have these, rights without remedies, without, the realization of the rights, is meaningless. And we know there's this persistent myth that Canada is a world leading country for children, that we are in the top 10 countries for the achievement of human rights and for democracy and well-being. But the data clearly shows Canada has fallen far behind other wealthy nations. We rank 19th amongst OECD countries for children's rights and well-being, and 67th on the Global Kids' Rights Index. And education is just one of the many rights that kids are, finding challenging to realize. And so I think it's an important conversation, timely conversation we're having today, and looking forward to speaking with all of you about it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sara. Jean-Frédéric.
Hi, yeah, so I'm Jean-Frédéric Hübsch. Most folks call me JF in the Anglo world anyway. I'm coming to you from Sherbrooke, Quebec, on the unceded territory of the Abenaki. My journey to children's rights started when I was working as a lawyer at the office of the Ontario Ombudsman, where the office started to receive complaints about school boards and school authorities in the province of Ontario, and I became the education law guy at the Ombudsman's office. And then at one point, I was thinking, I was working through a rather complicated case, and I was like, I wonder what the young person thinks. Like, I wonder what the student thinks, because I've been dealing with the parents, I've been dealing with the teachers, I've been dealing with the superintendents, all these kind of things. I just happened to bring it up in one of my conversations with an official, and they were like, "Oh no, we can't do that." And it was just this knee-jerk response, and sort of that was where I started. I was like, well, why can't we ask the kids what they think about an educational scenario? Now, in this case, it was a complicated case. There was lots of animosity. Like, I'm not going to get into the specifics. So, like, there were probably a very good reason not to. But the theoretical question stuck with me. And so it led me to think a bit about how children's rights shake out in school discipline proceedings in Ontario as part of a master's in law. And then I went on to do my PhD because I was just curious, so we talk about children's rights, in various sectors and in education, for example. But I was sort of curious, what does it look like to do children's rights every day from an administrative decision-making perspective, right? So how do we make children's rights real in the sense of everyday decisions that happen in the classroom, in the school, in board offices? And that's where my research has taken me. So I'm really curious about, how we interpret ideas of fairness and fair decision-making, but specifically in the school context. And that's what brings me here. So.
Thank you so much. And Geneviève.
Yes, hi. I think I connect with Sara and JF from a different perspective. So I have just graduated from my doctoral studies in a very interdisciplinary program. So I had applied human sciences, education, and transcultural psychiatry. So I consider myself an advocate for children's rights, but also through research. And I studied everyday participation. So that's where I connect with JF, but from young people's perspective in their everyday school life. So this is what took me from participation to children's rights. And let's see how I can connect with the topic today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So to begin with, let's take a look at Article 26 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations. It begins with the statement, everyone has the right to education. So as we open up today's conversation, can you share a little bit about what this means, where the idea came from, and how it has evolved in Canada since 1948? So Sara, maybe I'll pass it back to you for this.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. Now, this idea of education as a human right really emerged from the recognition after World War II that dignity, democracy, peace, and equality depend on people having access to learning and opportunity. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was really a groundbreaking piece of international law that recognized that education is not just something that belongs to a select few. It's a universal right that belongs to every child, every human, and and it obviously emerged out of a context in which people were, experiencing just threats to survival, let alone to development, and realizing that education is an essential element to the healthy well-being and healthy development of children and growing into productive fulfilled adults as well. The right to education was later reinforced by the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child and later the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which Canada ratified. That UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, or UNCRC as it's known, was ratified in 1991. And there's often a common misperception in Canada that the rights of kids and the UNCRC was this neoliberal agenda, but it was actually under a conservative government that Canada championed the adoption of the UNCRC and brought it into effect. It was Prime Minister Brian Mulroney at the time that really led the charge for that, and it played Prime Minister Mulroney led a significant role not only here in Canada but at the global stage, helping to get the UNCRC adopted and hosting the first UN Global Summit on Children. And I think within the UNCRC, it's important that it recognizes not just the right to attend a school, but really the fulfillment of this rights of children to develop their personality and their talents to their fullest, to be able to actively participate in society and the world around them. This idea of respecting human rights and diversity, and to be able to live in peace and dignity. So education is not just being physically present in a classroom, it's about access, it's about inclusion, quality of education, safety, and the ability to participate meaningfully, and the ability for young people to not just survive, but thrive. We, here in Canada, have made some important progress, through universal public education, inclusive education policies, advances in special education and equity initiatives, and the recognition of Indigenous rights through Truth and Reconciliation. But we obviously know that Canada has had a very complicated past, particularly when it comes to the rights of Indigenous children through the legacy of residential schools and the ways that education systems were historically used to harm Indigenous children into race, culture, and identity. And we continue to see real inequities for children, not just Indigenous children, but young people living below the poverty line, young people with disabilities, newcomer children, Black and Indigenous youth, youth in care, youth in northern and rural communities. So it's a right that has been established under international law for quite some time, but it's, we're still, even in a very developed, well-resourced country, it's really struggling to see the fulfillment of those rights for every child, for all 8 million kids in Canada. And I think, we at Children First are continuing to try and highlight that through our research and through our advocacy, because a kid who's hungry, who's unsafe, who's experiencing trauma, or who's isolated or struggling with their mental health is not able to realize the right to education. And, those are some of the thoughts I wanted to share, but eager to hear. I know JF has a lot more to share on this topic, so I'll turn it over to him to jump in.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so I think you got the holistic piece. I think is really important to take a really important takeaway from this. Actually, is that like we're talking about the right to education, but all rights are interrelated, interdependent. And so yeah, if the kid's coming hungry from school, or if the kid's coming from an unsafe home environment, or even just has to be on the bus for 2 hours because they live in a rural area, right? That affects the experience and the quality of education. And so just having access to a school is one part of the right to education, but there's also experiencing rights in education, and then also learning rights through education. So that's what we talk about at sort of the education rights side of things, of into and through. So it's really important. Another thing I want to mention in Canada specifically is, like, we have other legal mechanisms that do exist within the school systems, or that affect school systems, that purport to, or try to, or sometimes successfully do reflect children's rights concerns, right? So everyone has a right to education. We have universal public education, but then, is that a right that is justiciable? Is that a right that you can actually go do something about? So for example, in Quebec, part of its provincial charter of rights actually also includes a right to education that reflects almost exactly the United Nations Declaration and the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, right? So that's since the 70s that the Quebec has had this right in their Charter of Rights, not just as a matter of regular law. So that's really interesting. And then if you bring in the Canadian Charter later on, and linguistic minority rights under Section 23 of the Charter, that of course is part of the the Canadian constitutional sort of system of provinces being responsible for these rights. But as a matter of children's rights, and as a matter of Canadian legal history, minority language communities have a right to manage their own education, right? And that's actually very common in international, like all over the world. There's lots of minority language schooling situations, and that's one that is reflected in Canada that we don't think about as being like part of a larger structure. But there's lots out there, lots of folks doing this kind of work in different places to preserve their local languages. So I just wanted to bring those two pieces in, just because I think it's important to note that some of these provincial rights instruments, and even the federal rights instruments, that is a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, reflects children's rights to a certain extent. And then if we're going outside of the education realm, just to mention a few for those who are interested, now we are starting to see the Convention on the Rights of the Child explicitly mentioned in certain pieces of law. The Divorce Act at the federal level, for example, the Child, Youth and Family Services Act in Ontario that governs children's aid societies. So there is a slow legal integration of children's rights into Canadian law, but it's very slow. And then what we're talking about today, of course, is sort of like what actually happens on the ground. And that's, I think, the piece that's perhaps much more important in the long term. If we can get practices shaping how we experience rights, eventually the law will catch up. But I just wanted to mention that, yeah, there are ways that it comes into Canadian law, but it's not a matter of law everywhere. And it's a project differential.
Awesome. Geneviève, did you want to add anything here, or wait till we get into the more practical elements? Perfect. So Sara and JF, you've both raised some questions around there's current challenges undermining the right to education in Canada right now, as well as this idea that the right to education intersects with and is reinforced by other rights for the child, for the human. So what are some of these current challenges that are affecting child's rights to education at the moment? What does it look like in practice? So JF, I'll hand it back to you right now, because I know there's a lot of different ways that we can approach this question.
So because I have lawyer brain, I'll start with the legal ones. This is more of a sort of more playing out in the courts, but also affects everyday practice. So whether it's pronoun policies in various provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and how those are playing out in the court system. So there is sort of this idea of who controls the content of education, who controls the information that happens within the education system. So we'll get to sort of the parental rights discourse stuff in a later question. But that's one piece that's really playing out in the courts right now, the sort of constitutional question of how far can you go to limit rights in the school system, and whose rights can we limit in that way? So it's a really legal question. But I think it's it affects the everyday. It affects how students interact with the adults around them and how they interact with their families. But I think the big sort of practical one is just the integration of technology in education. We talk a lot about sort of what are the different ways of integrating technology. Should kids not have cell phones or not, and what's the impact of that? Should kids have access to laptops in their classroom? Why or why not? Should children be able to use AI? Why or why not? Those are playing out in the courts as well. There's some cases around Google and things like that. There's big questions about the role of AI in everyday life. And so that plays out in the classroom as much as anywhere else. And in some ways, almost the impact is greater because these are folks who haven't we have all as adults interacted with the world in certain different ways, but this is a way of interacting with the world that didn't exist when we were interacting with the world as young people, right? So that's always a constant struggle for education, but I fear the pace of change right now is really hard to follow and hard to track and hard to be accountable for. So that's one that I think trickles down from the legal to the policy level, to the district level, to the school level, and then of course to the classroom. And I saw it myself when I was doing some classroom observation in my own research, where students have access to laptops because the school board has decided every student at a certain point will have access to a school provided laptop. But when do they get to use the laptop, what do they do on their laptop, then becomes a whole classroom management question, right? That maybe wasn't there before. So that's a really interesting way. And the question of like, can students access different parts of things in terms of their speech and their access to information and their right to play and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very complex place, this sort of tech area and digital rights. And so that's a big one that of course is around. And then I think one piece that we're seeing a lot of questions about too, and this sort of bleeds in from the online discourse piece, is from the ed tech piece, is the online discourse and how that sort of translates into everyday life. Are digital spaces safe? How are they made safe? I think a lot of the discussion right now about banning access to social media, for example, is about safety for children. Okay, but children also, like, there are lots of kids who use those as safe spaces. There are lots of kids who use those for completely useful, wonderful reasons. So how do we manage that? And that's again a piece that's going to affect education. But the big one that I hear about in terms of the people side of things is just the social integration piece, especially post-COVID. Between the flurry of ideas that are out in the world, the movement towards integrated classrooms, which I think is really important, but that are not supported with sufficient resources or staff or processes to support that integration, plus social integration of newcomers. So it's the sort of wider societal issue that I think is we don't talk about it as much in the specific classroom space, but that's where all these intersections happen all the time. So yeah, those are sort of three big ones, I guess. So sort of the legal question of when can we limit rights, the tech question of how do we integrate technology given its pace, and then how does that affect the social world in the school and how people are interacting and learning to interact, right? I work with some folks who focus on it used to be called countering violent extremism. Now it's countering grievance-based violence, right? And that might seem like a big word, right? Those might seem like big words, but the reality is if you're going online and you're being influenced by, some random person on Instagram to do a thing, and then you bring that into the classroom, well, all of a sudden there's grievance-based violence in the classroom, right? And maybe that's an extreme scenario, but I think it's something worth considering as well. So those are the different sort of ways I think about controversies in education.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that kind of big picture overview of it. Sarah, it looked like you had something to jump in with as we kind of bring it down to like what the child experience is, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Through the Raising Canada research report that we produce at Children First Canada every year, we've been tracking a number of, we tracked the top 10 threats to children, issues around the fulfillment of children's rights, but also their ability to survive and thrive in life. And we've been seeing, quite a number of alarming trends. JF touched on a few of them already, but, whether it's the rising youth mental health challenges that young people are facing that predated, the mental health crisis that young people were facing long before COVID hit, but it's just been further exacerbated. We are seeing, been seeing this alarming trend around school absenteeism. It's like, every time we open the news these days, we're hearing pretty alarming reports about the absenteeism of children. There's movement in Ontario to try and change policy around this and tying it to grades and ability to complete their education. But this is a trend that's happening from coast to coast to coast, and it's very complex. That probably warrants a webinar unto itself. But it's a pretty alarming trend that we're certainly tracking. That's really sort of, I think, gets to the heart of the ability for children to access education and for it to be meaningful. We're seeing alarming rates of escalation of violence within the classroom and the school setting, behavioral incidents within classrooms. JF touched on the disruptions from COVID, online harms, and the digital addiction that children are experiencing, and just in growing inequities around poverty and social inclusion. So some of these are some of the big sort of macro trends that are undermining and threatening the ability of children to realize their right to education. Clearly, COVID was a major turning point. School closures affected academics in a very significant way, but it also meant children lost access to routines, to their peer relationships. Children went off, children who experienced violence in the home went off the radar of educators and other caring adults who would otherwise be, noticing and reporting on violence, and children being at risk of abuse. Lack of access to mental health supports, nutrition programs, extracurricular activities, having safe adults outside the home. So there's some of the major concerns that were brought to the forefront by COVID and that continue to be issues that children are facing day to day. And we're seeing some of the long-term impacts of that within the classroom and in schools all across Canada, whether it's the disengagement from school, increased anxiety, and the real concerns young people are facing around that, difficulties with emotional regulation, social developmental delays, and lower school attendance. So I really feel for educators right now. You're up against steep odds, and we know that teachers care deeply for the kids that they are supporting, but really feeling like you don't have the resources and tools and supports you need to be able to help your students to be able to not only achieve their the right to education, but to be healthy, well children. And teachers are being asked not just to do academics, but to be trauma informed, to be able to respond to mental health crises in the classroom, to be able to confront violence, to be able to you're expected to be the one educating students about online harms and how to be safe digital citizens. You're addressing bullying, family instability, and social polarization. Like I don't think it's ever been a harder task to be an educator than it is right now. And so these are some of the major concerns that we're seeing and tracking with our research, and not just in the research, we're hearing it directly from young people, kids who are part of our Youth Advisory Council, kids who participate in our Young Canadians Parliament program. These are issues that young people are talking about. It's not just like educators or parents concerned about these issues. Young people are facing this. They're speaking up and they're asking the adults in their lives, their parents, their teachers, and certainly their policymakers to do their jobs and really helping to confront these really complex issues and not making these decisions in a vacuum, sort of this idea that, that adults know best, but really bringing kids to the table in a meaningful way and helping to engage them in discussions within the school environment at a policy level, provincially and federally, to be able to confront these issues and bring about meaningful change.
Absolutely. The right to education definitely depends on other rights being fulfilled. And I think that's a really good segue. Like, we need to actually involve the youth into that conversation. And Geneviève, I know this is what your research work looked like.
Yes. Thank you for JF and Sara for this segue. But yeah, I wanted to kind of highlight that, yes, the right to education is connected to so many rights, and both your comments, it was like all of the rights, so I think it's all rights are indivisible, but when we think of the rights to education and in the classroom, they call all come, they all join there, and it's very complex, as Sara said. And of course, I'm thinking about the right to participate, young people's right to participate in society and decision making, and how does it connect to meaningful education. And so yeah, I think this is kind of one of the challenge also of this, I will say, era, that there's the right to education, like we talked about, the access, but there's the rights in education. How does it happen and unfold in everyday life? And I think that there's a lot of myths that can trickle down there in the everyday life. And I'm not here to kind of overburden educators and managers, but I think it's important to kind of reflect on these things. And let's see a little later. I want to see if Kathleen, you have something to add. But yeah, it's very interesting for me to hear everybody talk.
Absolutely. And I think this is a really interesting, there's the right to education, there's the right in education, like as a student, as a someone within our education system, what rights do you there have? And then I know in our previous conversations, we've talked about the right to be educated about your rights as well. And then because, of course, human rights are a very complex topic, it inevitably creates all sorts of common myths and misconceptions because people don't have a fulsome understanding of what it all means. They're indivisible, but no right is absolute. There's sometimes tensions between different rights. So perhaps we could move over and think about some of these myths and misconceptions that come up and how we might navigate those as we're exploring the right to education, and to a meaningful education. So Geneviève, since you opened that line of thought, why don't I hand it back to you?
Yes, thank you. So I have a few myths here, very short, that I want to address, but there are my take on some myths that people may have. I may have another position than JF or Sara, but I think one, we have started talking and we have introduced policies about the right to education, but I think that often in everyday life, we often think of education equals schooling, the right to schooling. And it's not false, but I think education is also broader than that. There's like, it goes beyond schooling. It means that there are educational possibilities and opportunities, everywhere in the relationships that we have with school authorities and teachers, between peers. And I think that if we, open the box about what is education, then we see also all the possibilities that is there in everyday school life. Um, if I can just lead to another quick myth, I think this may be easy to think about. Rights are not just policies or laws; they also happen in everyday relationship, like I just said. But if we think about policies trickling down to everyday life, so I can be helping implementing children's rights through my attitudes, through my micro gestures, the way I treat this child, the way I talk about children in front or with them. All of these are kind of postures that help implement children's rights at the micro level. And I think we have already talked about the implication or interconnections of all the rights, but that also means that it goes beyond just educating. It's about their development, it's about young people's development, but also, if we think about the right to education as a human right, it's about the development of all the people involved in the educational act. It could be managers and teachers, and kind of this intergenerational relationship that happens there, the well-being of everybody involved in education. And as a kind of final myth that I want to kind of quickly put here and then open maybe the discussion with JF and Sara and our fellow companions here, is that children's rights can be, a big policy that we try to implement, but it doesn't have to be a whole new framework that educators put in place. We have talked about the overburden that is there in everyday life. But I think what I've seen is that managers and school staff, they already have that kind of language, and they're interested in the best interest of children. They're thinking about these topics in their everyday life. So I think it's not completely new, to think about children's rights. It maybe the words are new, but it could be very conducive to kind of think of education as a right, for flourishing, for imagining communities, what we can do together. And yeah, so it's not completely new. I think there's already something that we can tap on, and it's not too scary. So I don't know if it resonates with others.
I love this like macro to the micro of how we live it out in our day-to-day actions. So Sara, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there. I think one of the hot button issues, as in Canada, but certainly in the province where I live here in Alberta, is this myth that children's rights undermine the authority of parents or educators, and this idea that parental rights trump everything. I mean, we've seen just within relatively recent history, parents, this uprising of parents really asserting their parental rights and around a whole host of issues, and educators who may deeply appreciate the importance of children's rights or human rights more broadly, but feel very reticent about bringing this into the classroom. And I think this isn't just a new concept. I've been around for a few decades now advocating for kids' rights, and I've seen strong movements, particularly from I think this idea that parental rights trump everything, and that kids' rights are this foreign concept that is at odds with our culture, at odds with religious teachings, what have you. But I think it really is rooted in misconceptions and myths that I think, because we know most Canadians actually have never learned or actually read the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, don't actually fully understand what it means and what the benefits are, because we know that rights-based classrooms, children who know their rights are much more likely to grow up, to be strong, confident young people. They don't have this deep sense of entitlement for themselves. They know what they're entitled to, but they use that to speak up for themselves and for others, and are much more caring, compassionate, engaged citizens. Young people who know their rights are more likely to stand up to bullies or to I think be meaningful contributors to their classrooms and to their community and to their country. So I think it's clear that rights-based classrooms lead to more deep engagement, to more respectful relationships, and to student voices being heard in a healthier school culture. A great example of this is we have a program called Being, Belonging, Becoming that teaches children about their rights, teaches them about Canada's democratic systems. It hooks into social studies curriculum and civics curriculum that teachers are bringing into the classroom. And there's one grade 10 class out of Ottawa in the Ottawa Catholic School Board where one of the students was, had this reputation for spending more time in the local coffee shop than the classroom. But for the weeks that his teacher was leading our Being, Belonging, Becoming program in class, Tristan was in school on time every day, deeply engaged in the classroom, really leading his classroom in a meaningful way. He's gone on to champion this program within his school and across the school board. And it's this idea that when kids actually know that they matter, when they actually have a voice on issues that matter to them, and when they have the sense that, yes, I have a right to education, but I also have all these other rights to be fulfilled, and I can contribute to making my life better and making life better for other young people, that leads to deeper engagement within the classroom, and it really helps to young people to have a sense that they can contribute. So I think that's a really important myth that we can be busting, and for teachers to feel more empowered to bring these conversations into the classroom and to be able to use tools like our Being, Belonging, Becoming program or other rights-based tools to engage students in a really meaningful way around the fulfillment of their right to education, but also their the broader range of rights that they're entitled to.
Beautiful. JF, go ahead.
I'll bounce off that. So the word belonging, I think is a really important piece because it comes up even in the Article 29 that talks about the objects of education under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, where it really is about living together, right? It's about learning to live together. So children's rights aren't about some child king saying this is what I want and therefore I shall have it. It's really about, okay, how do we integrate children as people in this world in the decisions that affect them, right? Like that's what the CRC is about. And that's why we talk about participation as an important part of this. And participation doesn't mean the child runs the process. The participation doesn't mean whatever the child says goes. It means the child has been given an opportunity to be part of a meaningful part of whatever decision is being made about them, right? And often that means simply giving them the option. Do you want to be involved? right? A child has the right to say no, just like an adult does, right? It's a consent issue. And if they say yes, okay, how do you want to be involved? Do you want to sit at the meetings? Do you want us to write a report? Do you want to do a project? So it's participate again, going back to like education is multiple things. Participation is also multiple things, right? And I think that's something that like excuse me, it's all well and good to have student participants on school councils, right? Have student trustees and school boards. Like that's great. That's a great way to engage folks in the decision-making process. But has anyone asked them, is that meaningful for you? How would this look better for you? What would you like to do? Like how would you like to engage? One thing that always struck me, and I'm a big proponent of school trustees, and Ontario has a pretty good system for it, but those student trustees, they can't make motions, right? Like they don't actually have the same legal rights as the other people on that board. Now there's reasons for that, but that's something that's maybe annoying to a school board, to a student trustee. So I think that's an important piece too, that participation and like saying that children have rights to participate doesn't mean children run the process. It means that they are treated as humans within this process, right? And I think that's a really important bit. And it's interesting how often when I do research into how to make processes more accessible to children, I'll give an adult like just like a checklist or something, and they're like, I want this too. And I'm like, yeah, we all want this, right? Because it's about belonging, it's about feeling included, it's about feeling heard. And the more you feel that you belong and include and are heard, the more likely you're going to accept the outcome, even if it's not in your favor, right? And there are studies in school discipline that show that, where if students have been engaged in the disciplinary process and it still doesn't go their way, they're more likely to accept it because they were part of that process, right? A wonderful quote from Joel Westheimer on a podcast I listened to years ago, where he says, schools' learning environments are teachers' working environments, and vice versa, right? So if we create a learning environment that is focused on belonging, on how to like create shared spaces, how to work across generations, how to explain your reasons for things, well, then all of a sudden the students are doing that in their everyday lives, right? And the teachers are doing that in their staff groups and things like that. So it is a whole cultural piece, to go back to what Geneviève was saying, right? Like children's rights are not this thing that get invoked as a legal matter, when you're in a divorce, that they can be. It's something that is a cultural thing. It's about how do we address students? How do we include them? How do we explain the why, right? And based on my own research recently, like that students in grade 6, for example, here understand that like teachers have obligations, teachers have responsibilities, and how they choose to do that, as long as they explain it to me, I'll think it's fair. Like as long as you tell me why I'm making these choices, it's probably going to be okay, because they're already a trusted adult. They're already in that position of trust, right? So this all comes back to my procedural justice research, where you talk about trust and you talk about voice and you talk about transparency, like knowing the process, right? And all these pieces are really important. Children's rights are designed for that. It's not really about imposing some external will. It's about using what's already there, but just making sure that you're including children as humans. So yeah, that's my.
I love that framing of this language of rights and the right to education as being a pathway to creating belonging in our society. So we've talked about, the big picture. We've talked about some practical strategies. As we come to the end of our conversation, what's one idea that you'd like our audience to remember from today's conversation and maybe bring forward into their work?
I can jump in here. I think one idea that I'd like people just to take away with them today and think about further is just this right to education is not, it's been a theme throughout our conversation, but it's not just the right to succeed in school. It's really about this ability to succeed in life. When young people know that they matter, when they have that sense of belonging, when they feel respected and valued, they're far more likely to learn, to participate, and to thrive in life. Schools are one of the most powerful places in society where we're not only shaping their academic outcomes, but helping them form their sense of self, their meaningful relationships with their peers and with caring adults, where they're learning about democracy and society and their place within it, and building skills that will help them to be healthy, well children, let alone healthy, well adults. And I think really helping them to have a sense of hope for the future. Kids who lack hope, I think one of the things that scares me most as a parent right now is young people just feeling this lack of opportunity, that they're going to go through their education but not be able to succeed in life because they can't get a job, they can't afford a home. I think we really have to help young people get back to the basics of knowing that they matter, of equipping them with not just the sort of ticking off the boxes for their educational outcomes, but fulfilling that sense of belonging and hope for the future that will set them up for success in life.
Beautiful. Go ahead, Geneviève.
Yeah, it's difficult to come back after such a comment from Sara, but if I can add to that, I would say that to be able to kind of bring back that hope into education, I think it's important to remember that the right to education and children's rights, they always happen at different scales and they support each other. So yes, we have the policies, but then we also we have power in implementing children's rights, also at the one-on-one micro level, and both scales are important. So to be able to give hope and recognize the value of young people, it can happen, in how we look at young people in small things, just like it's important to, put the policies and the infrastructure in place that supports everything. But I think we can also start there at the micro level and kind of put a seed for the hope to flourish.
Beautiful. And JF, you get the last word.
Okay. I think my last word is that, and I know we talked about not wanting to put more on educators, but at the end of the day, under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it is the job of adults in children's lives to help them realize their rights, right? So whether that's at the micro level, like Geneviève was talking about, which is I think probably the most important level, in terms of everyday reaction, or whether it's in the policy sphere, or whether it's just that children's rights won't happen without us making them happen, because children don't have political voice. Recently, even there's been discussion at the federal level, this is an anecdote, about a piece of legislation called the Keeping Kids Safe Act. Not a single child was asked about, right? So it's just things like that. Like, it is up to us to bring these ideas forward and to just figure out, what am I already doing that does this, that I can leverage, right? So I'll leave us with Article 5 of the Convention, because it's my favorite article since I've read my research, which says that states parties, so Canada and the provinces, shall respect the responsibilities, rights, and duties of parents. So first of all, respecting parents' rights is part of children's rights. To provide in a manner consistent with the evolving capacities of the child. This goes back to Genevieve's idea that this happens at different levels. Appropriate direction and guidance in the exercise by the child of the rights in the convention, right? So it is our job as the adults who care about children to make sure that children's rights are realized every day, and it is the state's job to support us. And that's what Article 5 of the convention says, and I think that's a really important reminder that, like, the state is accountable as much to us as adults for children's rights as it is to children for children, and we should use that power. So that's what I think.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. This is an incredibly complex topic. We've only had a few minutes to talk about it, but I do hope it has brought the importance of this topic in conversation to the surface and has given people lots to think about. So Sara, Geneviève, JF, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been delightful.
Thanks, Kathleen.